Welcome to episode 214 of Real Health Radio. You can find the show notes and links talked about as part of this episode at 7. So the word all spelt out, seven-health.com/214. Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of Real Health Radio. I'm your host, Chris Sandel. And for the last handful of weeks, I've been starting the show talking about the fact that 7 Health is taking on new clients. And at the time of recording this intro, we have just 3 spots left. And client work is the core of the business, the core of 7 Health, and it's the thing I actually enjoy the most. And after working with clients for more than a decade, I feel confident in saying I'm very good at what I do. And there are many things that clients come to work with 7 Health for. So getting periods back, eating disorder and disordered eating, being stuck in quasi-recovery, body image struggles and body acceptance. And for me, today's episode is touching on something that is at the core of all of these. So if you listen to this episode and hear yourself in what I'm covering, then I would love to help. You can head over to 7-health.com/help to read about how I work with clients and to also apply for a free initial chat. And this will be the last time I'm starting with clients in 2020. And as I said at the start, there are just 3 spots left. So if you are wanting help, then please reach out. The link again is 7-health.com/help, and I'll include that in the show notes. So this week on the podcast, I'm back with a new solo episode. And lately I'd been feeling a little boxed in with the solo episodes where I can't do one unless it's something I've done a ton of research on, and these shows just really take up a huge amount of time to put together. But I've realized that this isn't the only way to do a solo show, and I can still give out lots of useful information without having to be so research focused. And the intention with this one was for it to be just a shorter episode that I kind of knocked together pretty quickly. But once I started thinking about things and what I wanted to cover, it really grew into something much bigger than initially anticipated. And the topic for today is understanding restriction. And over the last 5 or 6 years, I've written a number of articles on restriction. I've also included it as part of podcasts when talking to guests, or it's made its way into some of the other solo shows. So the most notable recent time that's happened is the 2-part episode on sleep, where I talked about restriction for a fair bit of part 2 to start with. But knowing that A, not everyone listens to every episode or reads every blog post, I wanted to do this solo episode. And B, there's lots of things that I haven't covered before and that I wanted to include here, where there is just this one place where people can go to find out my thoughts all on restriction. And undoubtedly, I'm going to fail to include all of my thoughts. It's amazing how often I finish one of these. The episode goes out and I remember all the additional things that I wanted to say. So I guess this is my incomplete attempt at doing a complete job. I also did a recent interview with Carolyn Costin, and in it she mentioned binge eating quite a few times. And I've heard from at least one listener that this was confusing and didn't seem in alignment with what I put out in regards to restriction and its connection to binges. And with hindsight, I wish I'd done a better job in that interview and clarified her use of the term and explained my position more clearly. Because as I'll go through, I think the word binge or binging can have many connotations and can come with a lot of baggage. And for so many people in recovery, there is this fear that they are secretly a binge eater if they don't keep a tight grip on restriction, or that recovery is turning them into a binge eater. And so I want to make amends for any confusion caused by that episode and really clearly lay out my thoughts on the topic. And as part of this show, I'm going to link to and make reference to other podcasts and articles connected to the topic, which I'll add to the show notes. So if you aren't used to checking out the show notes and simply listen to the episode on your phone, I'd suggest for this one, it's probably worth going to the show notes and looking at all the supporting information and the stuff that I make reference to. And I really want to say that this topic is crucially important. Restriction is at the heart of the struggles with basically every client I work with. And as I'll go through, restriction can take many forms, but in one way or another, it really is being practiced by basically every client I see. And so I think that this is an episode that is timely but also long overdue. So to start with, I want to go through the many ways that restriction can be occurring. And some of these you may instantly recognize as restriction, but for others it might not be so obvious, or some people might not think of it as being so obvious. So one is like calorie counting, where some predetermined number is picked and then you eat in a way that means you match up to that number or you're below that number, and it's obviously just an arbitrary number. Number two would be macros or macro ratios, or focusing on macros, where you're deciding what breakdown of carbs and proteins of fat you're going to consume. And this usually is to restrict one of the macros. So you're going to be low fat or you're going to be low carb. Number three would be weighing food and making sure that you're not going over certain amounts, and again, arbitrary amounts that have been determined. Number four would be following a specific meal plan, and that this meal plan is less than what the body needs. So you're following something that's 1,200 calories or 1,600 calories, or fill in the blank for the number that you have been recommended by someone, that you read in a book, that someone said on Instagram, wherever it is, but that is actually less than what you need. Number five is avoiding certain categories or types of food. So this could be avoiding carbs or bread or grains, or not adding oils or fat to your food, or avoiding sugar or dairy, etc. Number six would be fasting, or intermittent fasting, or reducing your eating window, or eating one meal a day, basically playing around with the times at which you let yourself eat and having some rules around when you can and cannot eat. Number seven would be detoxes. So this is normally for a temporary amount of time. So say for 4 weeks you have a liquid-only diet, or you eat in a way that is cutting out whole chunks of categories of food that could be supposedly toxic foods, or however it's being presented as part of that detox. So it could be sugar or gluten or whatever makes it in. And then number eight would be following a specific diet. So paleo or carnivore or low fat, where there is this arbitrary list of foods that are good or bad foods, or you can and can't have. So those are a number of different ways that food is being restricted. And obviously this is on a continuum where things can be stricter or looser. And there are times where it generally makes sense, or genuinely makes sense, to restrict certain types of food. So if you are a celiac, restricting and avoiding gluten is a smart idea. So it's not that I'm against restriction or think restriction is bad in all cases, but the problem lies in that restriction typically leads to a reaction. It's not something that is benign. And with time, it starts to have a widespread effect on physiology and psychology, and that's part of what I want to go through today. So there are three main types of restriction. So I obviously went through lots of different ways that people can restrict, but these can then be broken down into three main buckets. And I want to go through each of them, and I think it's really important to understand this. So the first is physical restriction, which is obvious, and this is what people think of when they hear the word restriction. So this is when you're, say, restricting your total calories, and so this is below what the body needs. So even if you are eating a wide variety of foods, you're not taking in what the body needs to match up for its calorie demands. But it can also be restricting where certain categories of foods or specific foods are being restricted. And within this scenario, you could be either meeting your calorie needs, but you're doing it while you're restricting carbs, for example, or the restricting of certain foods can be happening in combination with the fact that you're also not meeting your calorie needs. And with clients, I see this second option is much more common. So where restriction of certain types or groups of foods also leads to restriction of total calories. And us humans evolved when food wasn't in abundant supply. Like if we failed to eat, And if we fail to eat, we die. And so it's become imperative that we were bestowed with a mechanism that drove us with this desire to eat. And when we eat less than we need, the tendency is for the body to want to consume more when given the chance. Your body doesn't understand that you want to be thin or you want to be toned or you want to look a certain way that our society deems appropriate. It sees that you're under eating and it's like, okay, this is a famine. So it wants to protect you by getting to you to eat food when it does become available. So while in the short term you can restrict or deprive yourself, as time goes on, this becomes more difficult, which is why for many people, they can restrict to start with, but at some point, it results in times where they can't keep this up and they start eating more. And how long it takes for someone to reach this point really depends on the individual. Like maybe it's a couple of weeks for someone, maybe it's a couple of years for someone else. But often there is a point when the ability to consistently restrict just stops, and the restriction is then punctuated with times of eating more. And now, just because you're eating more doesn't mean that the body is now getting enough. It can still be not getting enough to cover your day-to-day needs, or if you are covering your day-to-day needs, it's still not covering the debt that has accrued over the months or years or decades. And I actually wrote a blog piece about this called Your Body is a Manor House that goes into the idea of the repairs and fixing the damage that has accrued over years. So I'll link to that in the show notes. There are those for whom the ability to restrict doesn't stop and they can keep it up indefinitely. And while many may think that this is the holy grail and the place that you want to reach, it really isn't. And as I mentioned earlier, we evolved to have a desire and a drive to eat because it's important for our survival. Food and eating is crucial so that the body gets the calories and the nutrients it needs to do everything to keep you alive, but hopefully more than just alive, to keep you thriving. And so to be able to indefinitely restrict, thereby taking in less calories than the body needs over an indefinite period, that is a bug and not a feature. And it means that the debt is constantly amassing without something breaking this pattern. So while having times of eating more or having binges are seen as a loss of control or a bad thing, they're actually the body trying to deal with the increasing debt. It's attempting to correct the imbalance between what the body truly needs and what's coming in. And many years ago, I remember reading the book, The Gift of Pain, and it's about Dr. Paul Brand, who was a physician who went to India just after the Second World War, and he got interested in leprosy and wanted to know what was causing it and also what was leading to the horrible deformities that he was seeing. And he discovered the answer to both of these questions. So leprosy is caused by an infection. And in terms of the deformities, one of the main symptoms of leprosy is it damaged the nerves, and especially those of the skin surfaces, which leads to a loss of sensation. So meaning leprosy sufferers become unable to sense physical pain. And he showed that the deformities of the hands and the feet and other areas of the body weren't because of the disease destroying the tissue. It was because the sufferers weren't aware that they had burnt themselves or cut themselves or pulled something. And he tells the story of watching a leprosy sufferer cooking over a fire and some of the food dropped into the fire. And they tried a couple of times to save the food by getting it out with some sticks. But when this didn't work, they just put their hand directly into the flames and grabbed it. And their hand was, of course, badly burnt, that they felt no pain. And obviously that is an extreme example, but in everyday life, leprosy sufferers can find themselves picking up a hot plate but not realizing it because of the lack of sensation. They can be dislocating a hand or a foot or an arm after a fall but not noticing it because there's no pain sensation telling them so. Imagine when you're having a conversation with a friend, like while having that conversation, you are naturally and unconsciously shifting your weight from side to side to different parts of your feet and kind of going back and forth. If you were to stand still without moving a muscle, within a very short space of time, you start to notice pain. And it's because keeping those muscles engaged for a long time can be damaging. And so you constantly make these micro movements, engaging and disengaging different muscles, all of this without any thought. And the same thing when you walk or you run, you don't hit the exact same spot on your foot with each stride. There's these tiny little shifts so that different parts of the foot take the impact. And it can be in a similar location. So you normally strike with your heel or you normally strike with the front of your foot, but there are these subtle changes that means the burden is being shared. And again, this is done unconsciously. But for someone with leprosy, they don't get this feedback. They can stand in the exact same position for hours, never shifting their weight and giving those muscles a break. Or they can walk or they can run for 10K, never making the small changes to their gait, but instead hitting the exact same portion of the foot. And when this is kept up day after day, month after month, it leads to muscle atrophy and damage to the skin and tendon and structural problems. And this is the exact same with restriction. You want the body to give you feedback that you aren't eating enough to support your body. If you didn't get these messages, you'd be in trouble. So I know in many ways people wish that they didn't feel pain. But as I just explained, this has some real drawbacks and isn't the superpower that you may have thought it would be. And the same is true with hunger. Like many clients say that they wish that they were never hungry. But the reality is, if this was the case, just like with leprosy, it would end very differently to how they initially imagined. And there are many clients that feel like they don't get clear hunger signals. And this is true, and it's something I work on a lot with clients. But on closer inspection, when we do start to chat about this isn't actually true. Like maybe they aren't getting a growling stomach or some overt hunger symptom that they connect to their digestive system, but they are getting many hunger signals. And I recently wrote an article called You're Really Just Hungry, which looks at all the ways that the body lets you know it's hungry. And it really is that people have just disconnected all of these symptoms from hunger. So they're happening, but it's just not registered as hunger. It's chalked up to something else. So I'll link to that article in the show notes. And if you haven't read it, then I highly recommend checking it out. So that is the first type of restriction, which is actual physical restriction. The next type is impending physical restriction. So what is impending physical restriction? It is when you tell yourself that some form of restriction is ahead. So you're eating something, telling yourself that after this meal, you're not going to eat for a whole day. Or you're eating a food and telling yourself that after this meal, you're never eating this kind of food again. Or you're coming up to a meal and you're telling yourself that you're only allowed to have a small amount of it. That, say, when you go out for dinner tonight, you're going to control how much you eat. You're not going to have a starter or have a dessert, and that you're just going to get something healthy, in inverted commas. Maybe you even check the menu in advance and decide what you're allowed to eat. Or you're reducing your eating window. So you're saying, okay, now I'm only allowed to eat for 6 hours a day or 8 hours a day or whatever it may be. And so while you're eating dinner at 5 p.m., you're telling yourself that you won't be eating again until tomorrow morning. Or that next week you're starting a new diet. So next week you're going low carb. And from next Monday, all the carbs are off the menu. And it will mean you're just having lean protein and lots of veggies. It's basically all the ways that you're telling your body that some form of restriction is just around the corner. And obviously this backfires. And the most common way is that your body does the opposite of restriction. If your body feels like a famine or a period of deprivation is just around the corner, then it will want to eat. And it wants to stock up as a precaution. And again, this makes sense from an evolutionary perspective. If food was in abundance in the summertime but was harder to come by in the wintertime, it would make sense to be able to eat more and stock up your reserves in preparation for the leaner food months ahead. So there's probably some biological drive that is connected here where the body knows that if we're going to be entering into a period of famine, I need to be eating more in preparation. But there's also a psychological component here as well. And this is especially true if someone breaks the restriction that they set for themselves. So say you go out for dinner and you tell yourself in advance that you're only allowed to have a main and nothing else. And then you arrive and you're super hungry. And so while you're waiting, you start to have some bread or some olives. And then it comes time to order. And already there's this guilt that you haven't followed the plan. And so now instead of getting the quote unquote healthy option that you were going to get and that you had decided in advance when you looked at the menu earlier that day, you instead get something else. And then you're eating that and you're realizing that you've messed up and you really have already eaten too much. And so now you decide that tomorrow you're going to make amends. Like tomorrow you're going to hit the gym, you're going to hit the gym hard, and really you're just not going to eat much all day. Or maybe you're going to go the whole day without eating anything at all. And so then you get a dessert because the new diet starts tomorrow, and obviously today's already ruined. And so clients often talk about the experience of eating all the food before going on a diet. So they decide that next week their new diet starts, and then the preceding week they feel this uncontrollable feeling around food, and they find themselves eating way more than usual. And if the diet is going to be getting or cutting out carbs, then they eat more carbs. If it's going to be cutting out fat, it's eating more fat. If it's going to be going vegetarian, it's eating more meat and fish. Like they are preemptively stocking up on the foods that they're not going to be able to have before the restriction starts. And I've previously written about experiments that have been done with milkshakes and ice creams. And for those who are most restrictive in their thoughts and are restrained eaters, that once they have foods like milkshakes and ice cream and break their diet rules, that they end up eating the most. And because some threshold has been crossed or some food rule has been broken, it then becomes this like screw you mentality. New diet starts tomorrow, and they end up eating more than they otherwise would if there wasn't this restrictive mentality. So I will link again to that article in the show notes that looks at the studies if you want to check them out. But that is the second form of restriction, which is the impending physical restriction. And then the third form of restriction is mental restriction. And this is where you aren't physically depriving yourself, so you are eating the food, but mentally you're not allowing yourself to eat it. So, for example, you're eating a chocolate brownie and therefore not physically depriving yourself of it. But while you're eating it, you are chastising yourself for eating it or trying to eat it so fast that it didn't even happen. And look, this is actually the case at the start of recovery. Like you are physically eating food that you fear. And in the beginning, you really don't want to be doing it. So on one hand, you know that this is what recovery is about and that it is for the better. But on the other hand, you're afraid of this food and what it will do to your body. So there is this ambivalence, which typically means that physical restriction is disappearing or slowly disappearing, but the mental restriction is just as strong. And this is completely normal, and it can take time to mentally get on board with all these changes. But the goal here is moving in the direction of leaving behind the mental restriction as well as the physical restriction and the impending physical restriction. But obviously this isn't always the case, and often mental restriction isn't something someone is trying to get over. So a dieter could have mental restriction go on for decades without ever wanting to get rid of it. They don't want to be eating the cake or the ice cream or the chips or whatever the food may be. And so they aren't trying to get over the mental restriction. They're just wanting to get better at the actual physical restriction. And if you have a mentality of not allowing yourself some food, even when you are eating it, then what is this saying to your body? It's telling your body that it's likely in the near future that this food will be off limits again, that deprivation of this food will be starting, and then we're back in the territory or the realm of impending physical restriction and potential actual physical restriction. And this is how these all work together, as really these three types of restriction are connected and they do overlap. Like most clients, especially in the beginning, are experiencing all of these at once. It's not one type or another. And typically there is a clear cause and effect relationship. So where actual restriction leads to the planning for further impending restriction, and when this isn't successful in inverted commas, and when someone is eating something that they wish they weren't, there is then the mental restriction going on. And because of this, they're telling themselves that they aren't allowed it, and this then prompts more restriction or more impending restriction, and the cycle continues. And this is why I believe that restriction is at the heart of all eating disorders and is at the heart of dieting. Like whether we're talking about anorexia or bulimia or binge eating disorder or orthorexia, restriction is at its core. And typically this means physical restriction and impending restriction and mental restriction. It's not just one of them. And maybe this is obvious for anorexia, but it may seem less straightforward for maybe bulimia or binge eating disorder. Like the thought being, well, like how can this really be restricting? They are eating large amounts in a single sitting. Like how is physical restriction really going on? But even though there are moments of eating food and seemingly large amounts of food leading up to this, physical restriction is occurring. And then post this eating, physical restriction is occurring. And even if they are meeting their calorie needs because of the binge or because of this eating experience, the point at which it is coming in is only after a period of physical restriction and someone trying to actually avoid this occurring. It's not about allowance. And this is the part of the Carolyn Costin interview where I wish I'd done better, that when she was talking about binges, that this was clarified, because working on binges on their own isn't going to do anything if the core reason of restriction isn't addressed. Like if the focus is that binging is the problem, this isn't going to work when the binges are really a symptom of restriction. So I think it would be useful to talk about binges here. And this is definitely a messy topic because the word binge comes with so much baggage, and where restriction and say anorexia is thought of at one end of the spectrum and bizarrely is often thought about as good and about control, while at the other end of the spectrum is binges, where it's thought of as bad and a loss of control. And it is typical for clients to think of restriction and binges as being separate things where they're not connected at all. And it's amazing how many people I've spoken to who, while they were restricting and were able to consistently keep it up, they didn't see this as a problem. They actually saw it as a solution and being a really good thing. But it's then when they started to binge, that was when they saw that things were going awry. Like this is when that they noticed that they had a problem and then they needed help. And for them, the restriction wasn't the cause of the binges. The binges were suddenly this thing that has come out of nowhere and they don't understand why it's happening. Or maybe they think that actually they were always a binge eater, that for a length of time they had it under control, but now it's back, and that this is their default and will be the way that they're going to be for the rest of their life unless they can get the restriction back in order. And I find it hard to get on board with many of the common definitions of binging. And so a couple of examples to just sharpen it up a little bit is that binging is an episode of uncontrolled eating in which a person rapidly consumes an excessive quantity of food. Or another example is an unrestrained, compulsive, and excessive consumption of food. And the word excessive really stands out for me here, because what does excessive actually mean? Because from many experiences with clients and from doing this for a really long time, excessive can be highly subjective. So if you're trying to keep set calories below a certain amount, then eating a biscuit or eating a piece of chocolate, it's easy for that to be thought of being excessive and therefore a binge. And if you believe that sugar is evil and is destroying your health, really eating any amount of ice cream whatsoever could easily be thought about as a binge. Or maybe you're trying to eat to 80% full, or have some rule of what level of fullness you deem appropriate. And then you find yourself in a situation where you've gone above this and you feel overly full or just fuller than what you want. And you therefore rationalize that you've eaten an excessive amount of food, and it seems logical to then characterize this as a binge. So for many people, what they are describing as a binge actually looks and sounds like very normal eating behavior if they didn't have strict rules and hang-ups around food and their body, and they in other circumstances they wouldn't think twice about it. Or they've gone 14 to 16 hours since their last meal, so of course they're going to eat more at the next meal. Or lunch was nothing more than a collection of salad leaves and leafy vegetables, so it makes sense that they're eating more in the evening time. And so sometimes excessive can really be subjective and impacted upon just by someone's restrictive thoughts around what they deem appropriate. But also excessive needs to be thought about in the appropriate context. And this often means extending the time scale out when thinking about it. So there can be times when what someone eats in one setting in one sitting is a large volume of food. They're not just confused about why they're hungry after having a salad for lunch. Like, they actually sat down and ate a significant number of calories in one go. But what about when we look at this in comparison to what they consumed across a whole day or across a whole week or across a whole month? Like, is it still excessive? Like, if someone ends up having a binge in the evening, but they consistently ate less that day than they needed at every single meal, is it really a binge, or is it really excessive? Or maybe that evening meal is the only meal that they've eaten all day. Or someone ends up having a binge for days or weeks even, but preceding this, they did a juice cleanse for 2 weeks. Or in the case of recovery, when someone is hit by extreme hunger and they're eating 3,000 or 5,000 or 10,000 calories in a day, but preceding this, there were years and years of restriction and overexercise. So typically when you look at the binge, not just in terms of that one meal, but take in the longer time frame, the excessiveness disappears. And in actuality, the body is just trying to make up for the past restriction rather than this being about overconsumption. And I actually can't think of any client I've dealt with where there wasn't physical restriction connected to their binges. And Lou actually wrote an article about binge eating earlier this year that, again, I included in the show notes, and I really like her definition. So she defined or stated that binge eating or reactionary eating is a psychobiological response to restrictive thoughts or behaviors around food, overexercise, and other causes of prolonged and consistent physical energy deficits. In other words, binge eating isn't simply what you do with food. It goes beyond behavior to include your thoughts and feelings and demonstrates the intimate connection between body, mind, and emotion in response to restriction. End quote. And what I like about this definition is that it encompasses all three of the types of restriction that I've gone through already. So the physical restriction, the impending restriction, and the mental restriction. Like, binging doesn't happen randomly. It happens as a response to restriction. And as I mentioned earlier, if the focus is trying to get over binges, say through willpower or trying to wait for the urges to pass, long term this will backfire. Like, yes, you may be able to do it for some length of time, but if the underlying cause of deprivation and the energy deficit is still there, this won't magically go away. So the way to deal with binges long term is to deal with the different types of restriction that are occurring and to nutritionally rehabilitate the physical body and to change the mind and the emotions and the beliefs around food. And in the beginning, the binges will most probably get worse, or at least they won't be reduced, even though more food is included at other parts of the day. But that is the order that things happen. And this is a trap I see people getting into and that they're hoping for, that they will start to make their changes to their eating and to their allowance around eating only after the binges are under control. But this is backwards. And the way the binges start to decrease is by easing and abolishing the restriction and dealing with deficit. And I should add that sometimes there is a real protection of binges. So it's not that everyone wants them to disappear. There can be this fear that I'm going to be telling someone that they have to stop doing this, or that this allowance is going to be taken away from them. And for me, this is never going to happen. I'm never going to tell anyone that they aren't allowed to eat a certain food or foods, or that they're eating too much and it needs to be stopped. Like, as I said, like, restriction is at the heart of all of this. So I'm not going to pile on and add my own restrictive thoughts, because restriction is already occurring within that individual. For many people, they feel like they are a binge eater or they are food obsessed, and this is a permanent state, and like, it is never going to change. But again, this is something that is occurring because of restriction. There is a lack of allowance that is going on, and there is a lack of actual physical food coming in. And this is the driver. Like, this isn't a permanent state, even if it feels that way. It is the body's response to restriction. Can binging be occurring when physical restriction is no longer a problem? Yes, it can. But I think this is much less likely than most people think about. And really, as an idea, should only be entertained once the physical restriction has clearly been dealt with. And this can take months and years in some cases, and I'm going to go through some of the symptoms connected to physical restriction so you can get a sense of, okay, has this rehabilitation really occurred? Because typically it hasn't. And if it is occurring post-physical restriction, it's connected to the mental restriction and that they're not allowing, or it's to do with pending physical restriction, even if someone is then failing to be able to actually restrict. So if binging is occurring post-physical restriction, and once all of the debt has been paid in terms of the energy debt, then it is really those other two restrictions that are at play. And look, there may be exceptions to this, and I can't say that this is definitely 100% true all of the time. But this is what I've seen with the clients I've worked with and the people I've spoken with. And I should also add that often to deal with binges, there needs to be a change of language. And the word binge can actually get in the way of this, because a binge means eating in an excessive way. It's seen as this negative event that it's going to going against someone's progress. Like, it's a really bad thing. But as I've talked about, from a physiological perspective, it's something that is trying to save you. It's trying to end the restriction. It's trying to pay off some of the debt that is accrued. So far from being negative, it's a mechanism that is keeping you alive. And so either there needs to be a reclaiming of the word binge, so that when someone hears the word or says the word, it doesn't have those negatives associated with it, that to them it carries the positives that I've described above. Or a new word is used instead that better describes what is going on in a positive light. So rehabilitative eating, or repair eating, or even just I had a large meal, or I had a larger meal, and where large or larger isn't a bad thing. It's just a descriptor. I want to go through some of the reasons why someone may fail to see or fail to think that they are restricting, because it's one thing for me to look at the situation and have a view of why it is occurring, but what really matters is for the person who is restricting to see this. And there's many reasons why someone can be confused or not seeing what's going on. So for some, they are very much attached to the numbers. So they've been told by some online calculator that they need some amount of calories, or they read it in a book or a magazine, or a personal trainer told them this, or Jillian Michaels said so. And so they have this number in their mind of what an appropriate amount is, and so they stick to it. And this number is lower than what they need, but they just can't entertain eating more because it doesn't make sense that they would need more. Like, this is their number, and so they just think that that is all that they could need. For others, they are actually eating a lot of food, but this food is high volume and low calorie. So lots of steamed vegetables or rice cakes or corn thins, lots of salads. So they can be finishing meals feeling full or oftentimes overfull or bloated, but actually what they're taking in isn't very high from a calorie perspective and is lower than what they need. And sometimes connected to this is a statement I've heard many times, which is, I like healthy food. And so there's this feeling that this isn't restriction. I'm just someone who likes lots of vegetables and I really like salads. And so if this is what I like and they're supposedly listening to their body, like how could this really be restriction? And interestingly, in this scenario, when we do start to focus on things like satisfaction and satiety, and clients really tune into this, they realize that these meals aren't as great as they first thought. So they actually aren't very satisfied. And so what they've been chalking up to, I like healthy food, is more of a cover for their fears around weight gain or eating too many calories or eating foods that they deem unhealthy. So they kind of convince themselves that they are a quote unquote healthy eater, but really with another layer of awareness, their preferences are there for a different reason. Eating too infrequently can also be a problem and be a reason that someone isn't getting enough calories coming in, but not really noticing. So this could be someone who's eating 3 meals a day, but they're not snacking, but where each of these meals just isn't large enough. But often what I see, and this is probably more common, is clients who are saving up more of their eating for the evening time or for the later part of the day. So maybe they do eat breakfast or they do eat some snacks earlier in the day, but the bulk of what they eat, so say 60% or 70% or 80% of the calories are coming in the evening time or starting late in the afternoon. Or in some cases, they are just eating 1 meal a day, and this is in the evening time. And if the majority of eating is happening later in the day or in the evening time, even if you eat, say, dinner to a point of fullness or over fullness, this doesn't guarantee you've covered the energy demands for the day, and most of the time it doesn't. And this one meal seems so large that it just skews the perception of how much food is coming in, and that this must be enough food, or even that this must be too much food. Exercise is another factor that impacts on calorie needs, and the exercise is pushing up what someone needs, but they just don't see it as a big deal or a big energy demand. And this is especially true if someone was used to doing so much more and now they've reduced what they're doing, or they used to be doing something more intense and now they're quote unquote only walking. Even if walking is taking up hours a day, it's just not thought of as exercise because of what they used to do previously. And for them, it now feels like they're doing so much less, which is true. But in relation to the energy requirements for their body, this reduced amount of exercise is still creating a situation where there is not enough energy coming in each day. And this can also come back to the energy debt part as well, and the debt that has been accrued through years or decades of the overtraining and underfueling. Because someone could get to a point where they are consuming a large amount of calories and amounts that could be matching up with or even surpassing what they've used on that day. But with the idea or with the debt that is still outstanding, the body is still physically deprived for what it needs. And this idea is actually connected with all of these examples, that if there is previous underlying restriction that has happened and that this has never been dealt with at all or dealt with fully, the issue isn't just about what you did today. It's also about what's happened in the past and the fact that this hasn't been made amends for yet. Another reason someone may struggle to see what they're doing as restriction is because they're having binges or times of overeating more than they intend. And so when they remember these incidents, it makes them feel that they are getting enough in, or more often that they are eating too much. And regularly in response to this, they then increase their exercise the next day, or they delay their eating the next day. But again, for them, it doesn't feel like restriction because obviously they just ate all of this food and it's clearly more than the body needs. Another scenario is where someone is going out for dinner or going out for a meal on the weekend. Maybe they're going to someone's for a barbecue. So it makes sense to eat less during the day or to ramp up the exercise during the day in preparation. And to them, again, this doesn't feel like restriction. It's just what you do when you're going to be in a situation where you're having food that you haven't prepared yourself or you're eating in a way that is different to how you usually eat. So there's probably other examples, but those are the most common ones that come to mind for how restriction can be occurring, but it just fails to be recognized as restriction. And because it can be so hard for many clients or many people to get their heads around the fact that they may be restricting, sometimes it's easier to take the focus off the food and put it onto the symptoms, because there's many symptoms that can be associated with being in a malnourished or a restricted state. And this is something I cover in detail in the 2 episodes I've done on the Minnesota starvation experiment, which if you haven't listened to, you should. They're episodes 42 and 147 of the podcast, and I'll link to them in the show notes. Tabitha Farrar's book, Rehabilitate, Rewire, Recover, also does an excellent job of going through all the various components and symptoms that occur because of restriction. I'll link to the book again in the show notes, and it is definitely worth checking out. And I also want to add that restriction can happen at any size. Like, restriction isn't only a thing if someone is emaciated and matches up to the stereotypical idea of what an anorexic looks like. This is a huge stumbling block for many people, and is a real myth. Like, they think that if they were really restricting, they would obviously be completely emaciated, and that's not the case. So obviously restriction is not occurring, which again is why I find this list of symptoms so helpful. Because if you have many of these going on, then restriction is likely at play, even if you don't feel like you're restricting your food. So I'm going to break these down into different categories or groups. I mean, some of these overlap and could appear in a different section. So it's not so much about where they appear. It just seemed to make more sense to be able to break them down this way. So there's physical symptoms that you will likely recognize. And so feeling cold and an increased sensitivity to cold, poor sleep with difficulty falling asleep, staying asleep, increased nightmares, maybe getting night sweats, restlessness, increased digestive upset, so gas or bloating or constipation or loose stools or undigested food in your stools, acid reflux, delayed gastric emptying or stomach emptying, decreased metabolic rate, decreased libido, often with menstrual cycles becoming irregular or stopping altogether in women, and lack of erections or erectile dysfunction in men, vaginal atrophy, so leading to pain with sex or vaginal itchiness or dryness, brittle hair, nails and skin, and where these grow and repair more slowly, poor dental or gum health, increased craving for salt, increased desire for hot beverages, especially caffeinated drinks, decreased pulse, low blood pressure, and this can lead to occurrences of dizziness and feeling faint, especially when getting up from lying down or sitting down or with exercise. It can lead to actual blackouts, hypoglycemia or low blood sugar, which can also lead to dizziness and feeling faint, as well as nausea, and in extreme cases, this can be deadly. Heart palpitations, increased frequency and urgency of urination, and this can also be happening throughout the nighttime. Muscle cramps and pain. And counterintuitively, this can sometimes be worse in the beginning when someone starts to rest or have a cessation from exercise. Edema or swelling, and this can happen all over the body, but is common in ankles and feet and legs and arms and under the chin and the cheeks and around the eyes, decreased training performance or ability to exercise. Although with something like exercise, something like walking or other sports, this can often be overridden. And often in the beginning, as the body is spiraling with this stuff, exercise performance can even increase. But at some point, this starts to stop. Cuts being slow to heal and bruising more easily, increased incidence of bone fractures or injuries, elevated carotene in the blood, which can lead to yellowing of the skin. There can be immune system changes. So for some people, this means lots of recurrent infections and issues going on. And for others, this means just never getting sick. Anemia or lower amounts of red blood cells, which are the ones that carry around oxygen. And so this can lead to lower energy, but some people don't notice it as lower energy per se. They just have this feeling of being tired and wired. There can be difficulty swallowing. There can be lanugo, which is the fine hair that develops over the body. And there can be an increased pain threshold. So basically you become more numb to physical body signals, which is why often people can push through with the training, the exercise, even when their energy levels are lower, and in other circumstances they would be pulling up and stopping. Physical symptoms that you won't necessarily recognize will be a reduction in heart size, can be brain atrophy, can be bone density reduction. And obviously you can recognize these if you're getting scans or they're being investigated, but in your day-to-day you might not recognize them, or you won't recognize them. There's then mental and emotional symptoms. So there's increased neuroses with things like depression and anxiety and hypochondria and hysteria, and this can lead to suicidal ideation. There can be increased irritability and impatience, and this is especially true the hungrier someone gets, even though they won't necessarily notice this as hunger. There can be increased paranoia and defensiveness. There can be increased food thoughts. And these can be either obsessive food thoughts, they can also be anxiety-provoking food thoughts. There's a hyper-awareness of food and movement. So noticing what other people are eating and being triggered by comments of other people doing exercise or other people dieting. There's a fear of eating too much or of eating calorically dense or supposedly unhealthy food. There can be a fear of weight gain, regret and guilt because of eating becoming highly emotional. And this can mean that it can be incredibly difficult and incredibly challenging emotionally, as well as it being really prized and defended and the highlight of someone's day. Dreams about food. There can be a fear of stillness and stopping. Difficulty focusing and concentrating and even retaining information. Although in the beginning, the ability to focus and concentrate can get better. There can be a loss of ambition, feeling more alone and shut off, which in reality can also be the case where someone is isolating more and spending more time on their own. Indecisiveness. And this can be with food choices and what to have, but it can be indecisiveness in general, in life, in all decisions. Obsession with weight and with body checking, a sensitivity to noises and crowds, and many clients are already highly sensitive people, and this makes things even worse. I did a whole podcast on HSPs, and that's with Barbara Allen. It's episode 190, so you can check that out if that's a topic that interests you. The dulling of senses and emotions, so someone feeling just numb. An increased incidence of disassociation. So often as a coping mechanism to deal with exercise or the difficulties of life, they disassociate. And then there can be body dysmorphia and seeing your body differently to how it is in reality. And then there's behavioural symptoms. So increased length of time with your meals, eating more slowly, eating foods in a specific order, or other rituals around eating, or if you're eating something that you quote unquote shouldn't be eating, it could be eating it very quickly, or eating it while standing up, or eating it while watching TV or doing something else to distract yourself. There can be chewing and spitting of food, or the regular use of chewing gum or low-calorie sweets, the avoidance of eating in front of other people, an increased interest in preparing food and reading recipes and buying cookbooks and watching food-based TV programs, or watching cooking shows or food stuff on YouTube, increased walking and housework and standing and fidgeting and pacing, and favoring occupations that allow for movement. There can be a reluctance to participate in activities where the body will be viewed by others. So say swimming. And this is true even if somebody's body matches up to society standards and they supposedly have nothing to hide. There can be possessiveness and hoarding. So hoarding cookbooks and recipes and keeping the fridge and cupboards completely stocked with safe foods, but also hoarding of non-food items. So plastic bags or magazines or cleaning stuff. Kleptomania, so an urge to steal. And this can be food items, but can also be non-food stuff. Eating food out of dumpsters or food that's been thrown away. Compulsive spending or being extremely frugal. So those are at opposite ends of the spectrum, but both can occur. Prone to forming strong habitual habits, or increased OCD or OCD-like behaviors. A focus on trying to take care of everyone else instead of yourself. An increased ability to lie, particularly in connection with food. And this isn't always the case, but if someone isn't ready to give up this disorder and they're being challenged, then this can be the case. So that is a long but incomplete list of the many symptoms that can arise because of restriction. And some may occur earlier than others, and others it's occurring much later, and when they're more in the depths of being in energy debt. You won't necessarily have all of these if you're restricting, but if you are hearing that list and noticing that you're experiencing many of them, then restriction is a likely driver. So one final piece I want to mention before I start to wrap this up is the concept of cognitive dietary restraint. So cognitive dietary restraint is the perceived ongoing effort to limit dietary intake to manage body weight. So it's the mental burden of trying to keep up restriction. So to cut calories or to cut carbs or to avoid certain foods with the intention of modulating weight. And this would typically be because you're wanting to lose weight, but also could be to maintain a specific weight. And this is the burden that happens across all three types of restriction that I've touched on. So whether we're talking about the burden to actually restrict, to plan to restrict, so the impending restriction, or the judgment and the mental anguish when you're eating something that you are telling yourself that you aren't allowed. And the key thing to understand with cognitive dietary restraint is that it is a mental process. It's not actually having to happen in reality. So someone could be following a strict diet and experiencing cognitive dietary restraint, or they could be not following a diet, but simply thinking about their body weight and that they should be restricting and feeling like they're failing. And this means that cognitive dietary restraint is separate in its actions to the changes that happen in the body because of actual reduced calories. And often they go hand in hand, but they can be looked at separately. And why this is important is that the consequences of restriction or dieting don't only occur because of the malnutrition or when a certain level of weight is lost. Irrespective of weight, the mental and emotional impact of cognitive dietary restraint impacts on health. And I've actually done 2 podcasts on the topic. They're titled How Your Thinking Affects Your Health, Part 1 and Part 2. And they're episodes 102 and 127. And again, I'll link to them in the show notes. And the reason I'm mentioning them is really just to add an extra layer to this idea of restriction. Because as I go through in those episodes, many of the issues that occur in the studies that I look at aren't being driven by physical restriction. Sure, it is part of what is going on, but the mental component and the amount of cognitive burden that it places on the body contributes to the real physical symptoms. And it's a good example for why just eating more food while this is essential isn't enough. And that the mental repair and the change relationship with food, a la the mental restriction piece, is so important. Because without that final hurdle or that final piece, even if the calories are coming in, the healing is not going to be complete. So I want to close out this episode with a couple of thoughts. The more you try and control your food, the less control you'll actually have over it. And in the short term, you may gain some control, but over the long haul, you will lose your grip. And this is true whether this means you're ending up in a binge restrict cycle or whether you are able to keep up the restriction and are able to be continually rigid. Because this rigidity then stops being a choice. If you wanted to do something different, you then can't. So it's no longer that you are controlling your food, it is that you are being controlled by food. Being able to stick to something isn't proof that you are in control if you are then unable to do anything different. Too regularly, there is a focus on weight and becoming weight restored as the goal. That at some weight or some BMI, this is when things are better. But for me, this doesn't make much sense, because why does some arbitrary BMI determine that things are better? Restoration is complete when symptoms have corrected themselves, not when some weight or BMI is reached. Weight is a poor predictor of rehabilitation, and the focus on it as the arbiter of restoration really is a problem. It keeps weight as a focal point when its significance really needs to be drifting into the background. So if you want to know that restriction has now been abolished and you've dealt with all of the debt that had occurred over the months or years, you are much better going through the list of symptoms that I read out than focusing on weight. And when you are physically better, when you're emotionally and mentally better, this is when restoration is complete. And this isn't to say that this will all be about restriction. Potentially there are mental and emotional things that you will still need to work on with a therapist. And there's regularly issues and incidents that predate an eating disorder or predate the restriction that need to be dealt with. So I don't want it to sound like repairing restriction is everything and that everything will be repaired when this is dealt with. But I think the symptoms list is a much better guide than the number on a scale if we're thinking about the restriction piece. So that is it for this week's episode. As I said at the top, I'm currently taking on new clients, and at the time of recording this, there are just 3 spots left. If restriction in any of its forms are part of your life and you want help getting past it, then I would really love to be able to help. Or if you struggle to think of what you're doing as restriction, but that list of symptoms that I went through matches up with your experience, then please reach out. You can get in contact by heading to 7-health.com/help. So that is it for me. I'll be back next week with another show. Have a great week. Stay safe, and I'll catch you then.